It's all broken?
Nope.
Okay, good.
Incidentally, I did bring a few pins back from the trade shows, so if you're absolutely without a pin, I could probably come up with one or two. But I can't come up with one every day for the rest of the semester like some people always want me to do. Okay, I'm not the first guy that has done fairly extensive work that has heard somebody talk about the ultimate diagnostic machine. Have you ever, how many times have you gone to a dealership or have you heard somebody talk about, you need to go let them hook it up to the machine? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The machine. You gotta let them hook it up to the machine. They think there's supposed to be a machine that you plug it into, and I won't be the last one to hear that. So, even when a service technician is able to glance at a little liquid crystal display and get some numbers, does that liquid crystal display tell you what's wrong?
No.
It does tell you what's wrong. It gives you an idea of where you can look. An example, perfect example, the other day, whenever the lady came in here and she says, can you order me a mass airflow sensor? I said, why do you think you need one? She goes, because at the parts store they plugged in the tool, they told me I needed one. So I said, well, let me see what's wrong with it first, and then I think when I messed with it, found a vacuum leak because we pumped smoke into the intake and smoke came squirting out of that little vacuum, it was you. That little vacuum nipple was hard to see. It was way down there where you couldn't have spotted it, and if you didn't have, even if you did a really exhaustive visual inspection, you would have missed that, and the smoke helped us with that. So when you get your hands under the hood and you get your fingers a little dirty, you're going to do it. But I will not tackle most of your electronic or drivability jobs without a window in the system. I want to window into the system so I can see what the computer's seeing and what it's doing with the information, right? And if you have your data stream, you know, that's giving you information about fuel trim stuff, you cannot get fuel trim information from anywhere except a data stream. So you got really important information that's giving you. Fuel trim is one of the most important things that you can look at when you're trying to determine about the balance of the air and the fuel and all that kind of stuff. Well, I'm going to look at two similar situations here from a diagnostic standpoint that had odd fuel trim readings, all right? From a service technician's point of view, knowing the weaknesses that are prevalent on a particular platform is really important. Like if somebody comes to me, I see a check engine light on a Ford, I plug it in, I see a P0401, and I'm basically going to know that I need to look at the voltage at the engine coolant, not engine coolant, but the DPFE sensor. This is a bad one. It's supposed to be, if you look, about 0.6 of a volt on the metal sensors, and that's this little sensor like this one right here, this part of the EGR system, and the plastic sensors that you see on so many of them read about 1 volt. Then they have the ones that are built onto the EGR valve. So that's basically what we're looking at there. So when I saw that, if you get to where you're familiar with that, if you're working every day and you're out there and most of the time your shop is going to have a 1-hour diagnostic charge and they'll usually have another half an hour for the repair. Okay, so if you're getting paid $20 an hour, what's that? What's an hour and a half?
$30.
$30. So $30 you're getting, let's say, you bring the car in, you get right on it, you plug it in, you see your P0401 code. Now P0401 just basically means that it's telling EGR to flow and it's not seeing it flowing. More often than not, that's clogged EGR passages. But if you know your EGR passages, how can you tell if your EGR passages are clogged or not? Without actually taking it apart and looking at it. I'm going to do whatever I can to open the EGR valve and see if the idle quality deteriorates. And if the idle quality deteriorates, I know it's able to flow EGR. But if I'm getting a P0401, whatever's sensing it is what I'm going to look at. Now, a lot of your Asian cars for EGR flow is going to have a temperature sensor in the pipe leading between the EGR and the intake. And typically, they're going to have this thing set up so that when EGR flows, all the cylinders are going to get an equal amount of it. Some of them put it right behind the throttle plate. Some of them put it through little small holes in each particular, right there by each particular cylinder. If all of those holes clog up except one, you'll have a misfire when you crack the throttle and EGR starts to flow. Because if all the EGR is going into one hole, that inert gas is going to cause that one cylinder to misfire, and the rest of them are going to pop just fine. You'll see that on Ford Windstars, V8, V6, and on some Nissans. If you got a surge that only happens whenever you're driving down the road and you pull the EGR valve and it goes away, on some of these little Nissan 4-cylinders, you're going to see little EGR ports stopped up. So just keep that in mind too. All right. So what makes a competent technician is one, particularly in a platform that you've been used to working on a lot of. If you know where the weak links in the chain are, you'll know exactly where to look at.
What are we writing on?
Whenever I get to the end of this, there's a bunch of questions.
Okay.
So hang on to that. Do your notes in addition to this, okay? You should have a note page too, which I probably didn't give you. Write your notes on the back of that paper and work just fine. Okay. Now, if we've got a DTC that throws us for a loop, like we got a PO172 system rich or a PO173, which is a fuel system malfunction, or any of a half dozen other fuel trim codes, what we're looking at here, the O2 sensor, how often is the O2 sensor actually faulty? Now, do you pull codes over at where you work? Okay, how many O2 sensor codes do you see, or O2 related codes?
A lot.
A ton of them. And how often do you sell an oxygen sensor?
Not very.
Not very often, because a lot of the times the oxygen sensor is in a bad place to get to. And it's not anything you can pop on there easy. The ones you really like are when you pull a code and the sensor's right on top and you can change it out and you fix the car and it's on your way. How often does that happen? What percentage of the time you think?
Say about 2.
About 2% of the time. Basically, you can plug it in, and maybe if you're the mass merchandising parts house guy, they like for them to say, oh, look, I need such and such a sensor. Here's $200. Give me that sensor, and I'll go have my buddy put it on. And then his buddy puts it on, and they say, crap, that wasn't what was wrong with it. I spent $200 that I need to spend, right? We got to find out what's wrong. Okay, about half the time, you know, a lot of times, and this is something that I used to see on oxygen sensors, you would get the oxygen sensor code that indicated it went lean, and then you would get a code that was the opposite of that indicated it went rich. Okay, so in other words, it was a lean adaptive limit, and then it was in the rich adaptive limit. But what a lot of people don't realize is that oxygen sensors, some of them, there's different ways that they fail on different vehicles, which is really weird because it seems like they all do about the same. Sometimes driving down the road when I was working at the Ford place, we would see oxygen sensors that would just flatline sometimes without any reason for it, because they would just all of a sudden go to sleep and quit working. And then they would wake up again. Well, when they flatline, what is the flatline? What is the low voltage on an oxygen sensor telling you? Is that lean or rich? That's lean. That means that it believes there's too much air. If it remains in closed loop fuel control, where it's paying attention to those oxygen sensors, it's going to do what to the fuel trim?
Just start turning it off.
It's going to go up. It's going to start, it's supposed to be bouncing close to zero. Your short fuel trim is actually going to start bouncing up pretty quick. And if it hits the top of, to its adaptive limit, then it's going to ratchet the long fuel trim one click up. And then it's going to go another click up. And it's going to go another click up. And it's going to keep going until it adds enough of that course adjustment fuel to where the short fuel trim goes back to zero. So you may look at your scan tool, and you may see short fuel trims at 0 and long fuel trims at 26%. You got me? Now shouldn't confuse you, because the long fuel trim has added enough fuel, right? It's added enough fuel so that whenever so that it's going to get that short fuel trim back to 0. If it can do that, then it has managed to clean up your exhaust again. In spite of the fact that something's out of balance, it's basically having to do this, okay? So basically, what we used to do, and I was telling somebody one time about how these things could flatline. And the guy that he was talking to had been a dealership mechanic for a while. He said, no, I don't think they can do that. Well, I'd seen a bunch of them do it. Well, anyway, so here we go. The quickest way to determine. All right, let's say this. Let's say that you come in here and your fuel trim numbers are out of kilter. And you do a smoke test, like she did, right? Or like he did. And we found a vacuum leak. And we fixed that vacuum leak. All right, now how are you going to know if you fixed everything that was wrong? In other words, your vacuum, let's say your short fuel trim was at 0, and your long fuel trim was at 26 because you had some air going in there that was not metered by the mass airflow or whatever. Okay, whenever you got an air going in there, it's not being measured, the oxygen sensor picks up on that, that's when your fuel trim goes crazy. I'm going to take, when I'm doing my repair, I'm going to pull the battery cable off. Just pull it off. And it's not because I'm worried about shorting anything out. It's because I want the computer to forget all of this trash. All right, while I've got it off, I may go ahead and pull the air inlet tube off, and I may wash the throttle body out real good, and the idle air control passages, and do all that while I'm at it. Because sometimes if you just pull the battery cable off and then put it back on, it may have trouble idling, or it may roll, or something like that. So basically, you get it ready to put back on. I'm going to crank it back up after I've fixed my vacuum leak and after I've done this stuff, and I'm going to watch the fuel trim. If I see that short fuel trim, I'm going to watch it when it closes loop. When it goes into closed loop, oxygen sensor can be trusted, and it's ready to start paying attention to it. If I see that short fuel trim going away from 0 really fast, I'll know that I'm not done. I need to work on it some more. Long fuel trim does not correct as fast as short fuel trim does. It just doesn't do it. So basically, the long fuel trim will go back to 0. The short fuel trim will go to 0. Watch it go into closed loop. See what the fuel trim does. Because see, what happens is, you say, oh, I found a vacuum leak, I fixed it. Poof, you put it back on there, you clear your code, and if they come back the next day because you didn't get it all fixed, now you got to come back. Now you gotta look at it for free if you're working on commission. Or even if you're not, the shop's gotta work on it for free, and he don't really like you having to do that. He wants you to do money turning stuff. So, that's one of the little things there. So, here's a little story. My buddy, I stopped by there one day, and he goes, I've got an oxygen sensor I think is bad on this Jeep. So he pops an oxygen sensor into it. And so, we drove it again. And the fuel trims did not normalize at 0. They went off toward McDuff's again, up high. He says, this is really irritating me because I thought I had this fixed because usually an oxygen sensor takes care of this. And I said, have you noticed what your barometric pressure reading is? Now, what's barometric pressure at sea level supposed to be?
0. 1 bar.
Well, 14.5 pounds. And so basically, if you look at your mass airflow, and it's reading high, I mean your barometric pressure is done by your map or your mass airflow. If it's reading high altitude, then it's not going to put as much fuel in there, and the oxygen sensor is going to pick up on that, and it's going to start putting fuel in there. See, he was still having that same issue. That says, let's look over here at your barometric pressure coming off your map. And whenever we found that, it was way out, okay? This particular sensor here on the Jeep is the one I'm talking about. See that sensor right there? Jeep's map sensor, like NASA map, it supplies barometric pressure. Now, barometric pressure is important because at higher altitude, the air is thinner and the air-fuel mixture is supposed to be different. And for a long time, they wouldn't, until you got up to 4,000 feet, the electronics could keep it lined up. But your timing has got to be different, your air-fuel mixture has got to be different, and other things. You go above 4,000 feet, you had to make some altitude modifications back years ago.
Well, what about if you go below, like if you went to New Orleans?
Or the Grand Canyon.
Yeah,
I mean, not the Grand Canyon, but the Death Valley, where it's 240 feet below 0. It's basically going to pick up on that change. Now, I'll tell you something. Huh? No, not that low. Because you can't go, well, now, in Israel, you know, right there where the Jordan River flows into the Dead Sea, you know what the altitude is? 1,300 feet below sea level.
So there would you have to?
Fighter planes in Israel have to have special altimeters to fly below sea level because they're flying below sea level when they're flying, you know, fairly low. You know, that's the lowest place on the face of the earth is where the Dead Sea, the Jordan River pours into the Dead Sea. So you may have to do some modifications there. I don't know. I haven't worked on anything that works over there. Although I did get a call one time from Africa when I was working at the Ford dealership, and this guy wanted to know how to get a Jeep started. And he had Italian mechanics working on it. You ever talk to anybody from Africa? And try to talk to Italian mechanics, you can understand what them guys are saying, you know. All right, so anyway, but we got it started, believe it or not. Okay, so here we go. Now then, he'd already done all the vacuum leak checks and all that kind of stuff, and for years, before we had a smoke machine, how did we find vacuum leaks? Can you always hear them? No, you can't.
Carburetor cleaner.
Yeah, a little carburetor spray or propane enrichment. You take a little propane bottle, and you leak a little propane along there. And if it pulls that propane in there and it balances things, you say, I got to leak somewhere right here, see, and all that. Remember to pay attention to your fuel injector O-rings, because sometimes they'll get hard and crack and leak and all that kind of stuff. Okay, second story. Here's our second story we're going to talk about. We're going to get through this before you know it. Okay, we had this Dodge Stratus right here. See the Dodge Stratus? This Dodge Stratus is one that I've mentioned a couple of times before.
Yeah, you've shown us that picture once.
Yeah, it went to a shop down there, and it basically had an oil leak that they said was the rear main engine oil seal, because it was just wet all down there, and they were wanting $1,000 to change the rear main engine oil seal. Well, the girl's dad worked here at the college, so he had to bring it up here, and says, let's just find out for sure where it's leaking before we condemn the rear main oil seal, because it's really easy to say rear main seal. You know, like on that one there,
yeah, what you just said.
There was a little hole there, and you can see it coming out of the bell housing, so it probably is a rear main seal on that Miata we just looked at a minute ago.
Yeah.
But the long and the short of it is, we basically went ahead and put some dye in this one, and this is what we saw. Now, what is that? Where is that at? Read it.
It looked like a blood.
It claimed it was coming from the rear main engine oil seal.
Cylinder head.
We found this dye, this is what the dye looked like, it was coming from that corner of the cylinder head. See it all ripping off there?
Is there a bolt missing there?
No bolt missing,
Okay,
it's just
what's
the
that
gasket
hole?
sticks out there and all that. But there's nothing missing, nothing wrong, except for the fact that this particular, that is a pressurized oil passage. You were looking from below here before, remember that little hole right there? You're looking at, and this oil is pressurized lube that goes to what? The camshaft. It's an overhead cam. So it's got overhead cam, it's got to have pressurized lube oil going up to the camshaft. This particular, if you've got a really bad oil leak, and this seal becomes compromised, which is a part of the head gasket, you gotta pull the head off to replace that. Okay, what else do you have to do when you pull the head off? This is where the oil leak was. We got the oil leak figured out and fixed. But it wasn't leaking from the rear main seal. You know, we actually put a head gasket on it and took care of the oil leak. No problem, no more oil leak. So what else do you have to do when you're pulling the head off a 2.4? Somebody did one in here the other day. Timing belt, you guys. Because the timing belt, you know, the timing belt goes up and it spins the cam, right? Okay, so we had to replace the timing belt. Well, that's just fine. Well, he comes back about 60 miles later. And he says, we got check engine lights, we got low power, we got, and so plug a vacuum gauge in, we had a low engine vacuum.
At a time?
Yeah, but it wasn't when it left. It was perfectly in time. I looked at the timing marks. The guy that did it really, he worked really hard, he did a good job, put it together right, in the timing marks right, it cranked around like a sewing machine. Now this one wasn't particularly spooky because it doesn't bend valves. You got me? However, what we found, what we figured out to start with, now, there's several things that can cause a little vacuum, but the first place we looked, we went back to our timing. See the timing marks?
Yeah.
You saw this before, didn't you?
Oh, yeah.
Timing mark there, timing mark there. Now, when you put yours together, you were a little confused because they were like one tooth up. Remember that?
Yep.
So you got to make sure you run the line all the way across. That one was still where it ought to be. This one had gone up there. What can cause that? Can you read the words? If you don't clean that area out, go and blow all the debris out of there, and you scrape the gasket or something, or there's any kind of piece of something, if it flops, or maybe it's laying on a little ledge that's on the block, if it falls off and it rides that timing belt down, and it goes around that gear, boom, 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 you've jumped about 3 teeth. Wow. You may have done it right, but if there's any trash in there, it's gonna, or you know, like a piece of a gasket or a piece of a, you know, rubber or whatever that came from the old timing belt or whatever you're gonna fool with, it basically can cause it to do this kind of thing without warning. And that's particularly what happened there. So the long and the short of it was, we had a situation where this thing left here in time and came back out of time. And that's revolting development, right?
Okay.
Okay, now then.
What I just learned is always blow out the timing chain area.
Blow everything out really good. And just like the Crown Vickies, when you're pulling intake manifold gaskets off, before you pull, or spark plugs, any of that stuff in, blow all that stuff out of around there so that nothing falls in there.
When we did the Dodge, that's up there now that they're doing the tank on, when we were doing the spark plugs, we had to blow it out. There was dirt and all those things.
Yeah.
There was dirt in the threads on the ones that we pulled out too.
Yeah, just blow all of that stuff out of there really, really good. And because if you don't, you know, we pulled an intake manifold off of the police car one time that we got here, the trainer car, that's the police Crown Victoria.
Yeah.
When we pulled it off, there was a little roll pin that fell in there, got on top of the piston, cranked it up, we got an engine knock. All they did was change the intake. But they were totally innocent of any wrongdoing except they didn't blow all the stuff off the top of the intake. And who would have thought there was a little piece of a roll pin, I don't know where it came from, but it was laying there just waiting to go in there and land on top of a valve.
Well, I always put shop rags over it.
Well, yeah, but if it falls down when you're pulling the manifold off,
True.
you got me? That's how that kind of thing works. All right, so
every time something comes in, blow it off.
yeah. Well, the machine, and when we hooked the machine up, we actually were looking for something else, and we had to go back and look at mechanical stuff. The machine cannot tell you if it's out of time unless it happens to have cam sensors that will report that. You got me? All right, so now we're going to move on to the test questions. We're checking a late 80s high mileage Honda Accord for a blue smoke and idle problem. The car runs fine otherwise. The compression test reveals compression that is considerably higher than normal. As you consider the evidence, which of the choices below would make sense?
Advanced valve timing.
Why?
My dad said when I had my truck, mine had valve timing messed up on it.
Okay, so why does that
And
why does it make the compression higher, and why does it make blue smoke?
Oh, it's letting oil get in there somehow. That's why blue smoke is, right?
Well, yeah, that's really...
Now, as for the other thing, I have no idea. My dad just said that, and that was what the problem was. We got it fixed.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what happens. Your piston's going down. Your intake valve's supposed to do what? It's supposed to stay open until the piston gets to the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And the atmospheric pressure is pushing the air in, or the turbocharger, or whatever.
If it closes early, it starts pulling
What if it closes early?
It's going to pull oil.
It can pull oil up in there. You got me? If it's early enough. What happens when it pulls oil up in there? it wets the rings and it makes everything really nice and, it's like you're doing a wet test all the time. You know what I mean? Like when you squirt oil in the, like when you're doing an engine, working on an engine, you do compression test, it's low, you put oil in there and the pressure comes up, you know, because the oil seals the rings a little better. That's basically where the oil smoke's coming from, where the higher compression's coming from. Got me? And it doesn't have to be on some of them, it doesn't have to be off very much. Okay, let's go. We've only got 10 of these questions. Honda came in driving hot, and your technician checked the compression immediately. Now he comes to you with a complaint that his compression gauge is stuck in one of the spark plug holes. He can't get it to screw back out of there.
Because it was hot when it came in, and when it cooled down, it sealed it tighter.
Yeah, it did. It sealed it tighter. Well, he can't get it to screw back out. He doesn't know what to do about it. His hose won't disconnect from his adapter, so he can't use a socket.
It's B.
Huh?
Screw in the other spark plug, start it, let it warm up, and pull it out.
Heat it up, and it'll screw out there. Got it? That's how you do that. Nothing complicated about that. Now, whenever you're doing work on Fridays and Saturdays and next week, you may run into this. You know what I mean?
Why can't you?
A new technician just removed the transmission and replaced the one-piece rear main engine oil seal. You saw the seal after he installed it, and it looked just fine. Now the oil leak from the flywheel housing is twice as bad as it was before. What do you suppose is wrong there?
Let's see.
He gouged the sealing surface of the crankshaft when removing the seal. Because how do you remove a crankshaft seal anyway?
You get that seal puller.
Yeah. Well, you can't really do that with a seal puller all that well because you can't get it in there.
Yeah.
All we usually do, we knock a little hole in the seal because it's got a metal shell. And we knock a hole in there, and then we take a screw and we screw it into that hole. We knock it in the seal. And then we take our needle nose and we pop that seal out of there. Now, if you're not really careful, if somebody's really acts ugly, they can gouge the thing out.
Okay. The garter spring
The
pops
garter
out.
spring pops out of the seal while he was installing it. If that happens, you won't be able to tell it until you put it back together and oil's poured out of there like water out of a bucket. Some people will take a little bit of grease and put it in about 4 or 5 places to hold that garter seal in place. Now, that garter seal don't come out very often, but we had it happen here one time. And boy, when we cranked up that car, it just poured all out of there. Because that's a pressurized feed, see, to that bearing. The rear main engine oil seal wasn't the problem to begin with. Oh, wow. What else can leak back on the back of that motor? What about that? And we've seen this here.
Hub seal?
No, I'm talking about on engine oil. Where you can tell if it's engine oil leaking out, it's coming out of the engine, not the transmission. You're thinking clearly. While you've got it out, let's jerk the torque converter and put a torque converter seal in it too. That's just smart. If you got the engine out, I guarantee you when we put that one back in you're working on, it's going to get a torque converter seal. But we don't have to pull it back out. We don't want to, at least we want it to be dry as bones. All right, so the camshaft, the plug that goes behind the camshaft borders on some of these vehicles will leak oil.
Okay.
Now some of them have got an expansion plug back there, but some of them got a funky little plug that's got rubber around it.
Yeah.
Some of these Dodges are like that. And I've seen those Dodges leak like that. Here's something else, guys. If you pull the transmission out of one to do some work on the transmission or whatever, or if you put a transmission in it, let's pull the flywheel off and see if you've got leaking freeze plugs back there, or maybe a leak in it, rear main. Because now's the time to fix that.
Yeah, well, you already have it out.
Well, you already got it out. And you might want to do a really close magnifying glass inspection of that doggone flywheel too. Hey, Moody. Wasn't your fault the flywheel cracked, but we wish we'd have put one in there, didn't we? Moody says, you know what Moody was saying? Everybody gets a flywheel from now on. When I pull the transmission out, flywheel costs $50. Why don't we throw one at it? Okay.
So, was that answer D?
Yeah. Yeah, all of it. If you're working on a 99 Jeep Cherokee for a power door lock problem, the doors will unlock just fine, but they won't lock with either door switch. They also lock and unlock with the fob. They'll lock and unlock with the fob, but they won't lock with either switch.
Let's see.
All right. What's the most
Bad
likely
door lock actuators.
No, wait a minute. They lock and unlock with the fob.
They lock and unlock with
The driver door module.
Okay.
Let's look at the schematic.
You turn the light off?
Yeah.
Which door?
Look at the schematic. Got it? Here's your driver door module. Here's your passenger door module. Got fuses up here. Here's your remote keyless entry module. This one here receives what you're shooting with your fob. Your fob is read by this. Okay, your fob is what's sending signals here. Door lock control, door unlock control. It's getting a signal that can lock and unlock it. However, neither this, which has a switch built onto it, or this, which actually has a switch in it, will lock the door, but both of them will unlock it.
Could it be a bad switch? Could they both be bad on unlock?
Driver door module, I've had that problem before,
What's that?
with the driver door module.
Well, now the driver door module, that doesn't
I
explain why
think
this one won't
passenger
work.
door module.
Because it doesn't
I
go
say
through
both of
this.
them.
I mean, on this particular one, everything goes through the passenger door module. The passenger door module is gonna respond to signals from this and from that.
Okay.
And remember, they're not totally inoperative with your switches, they just won't lock. You can unlock them, but you can't lock them.
Okay.
Is it
Got it?
something,
And there's your actuator.
No, I think it's the passenger door module.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know how I knew this? I had a Jeep that did this. And all I did was look at the schematic and think about it, and I came up with that. This right here, because of the fact that it knows how to lock and unlock the doors, as is evidenced by this, you know, it has to be something wrong in here as far as both of these switches. When I put the passenger door module on it, everything's fine. Why do you suppose they put all of this electronics in the passenger door module and not in the driver door module? Because the driver door module's too crowded. It's got old switches on it. All they got to work one, you know,
You
switch
got,
or two.
you got all the windows and you got the
yeah, you got a
mirrors.
window and a lock switch over there. That's right. Okay,
So,
you're
wait,
receiving.
we didn't get to read the answers.
Sorry about that. I should have backed up. My bad.
Alright.
Passenger door module. Let's see. You receive a Keel engine running code 41 on a 1987 Ford Ranger. That's lean exhaust, right? This is back when we still had 2-digit codes. Installing the breakout box, which is basically letting you get on all your pins, you check the O2 voltage signal from the sensor and find 2.38 volts.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's supposed to be 0 to 1 on those older ones and everything, unless it's got one of these air fuel sensors that has to get to 1400 degrees before it starts working. It's got all those wires going to it. Checking continuity from the PCM to the sensor, you find good continuity, no shorts to power. Yet you're still reading 2.38. The signal wire connector pins are all tight, so you don't have any loose pins in here. You got me? What's the most likely cause of this problem? Try this one.
Contaminated sensor.
A loose O2 sensor ground. On those old 60-pin engine controllers, on those Fords, 20, 40, and 60 were grounded, so was 16 and 49. 16 was ignition ground, 49 was oxygen sensor ground. It's an orange wire that hooks to the back of the head on the V6s, and a lot of times they'd be dancing around loose, and you'd be reading 2.38, it would run rich as a dog, but it would read a lean code, because it couldn't tell if it was running rich or not, because it couldn't trust the sensor. So it was actually interpolating that as a lean condition, in spite of the fact that it's 2.38 volts. It wasn't being told the truth. On a 1984 Mazda RX-7, it's been in your shop 6 times for the bad rear axle bearings in the last 6 months. I talked about this before. On the last visit, you replaced the entire rear axle assembly with a new unit. Now both bearings have failed again. True story. This is not a joke. This is not a test. Actually, it is a test. But basically, what's going to cause that? Quincy, you know, don't you?
It's the driver.
It's either A or B.
Huh?
It's the warp drive
It's either
shaft.
B or D.
A warped drive shaft. How's that going to make the axle bearing? So the drive shaft's in the middle, the axle bearing's right here.
A,
Or a bent
Or the
frame.
frame bit, huh?
Bent frame? No.
D.
The customer driving the car to work? No, he's basically, it belongs to this guy that's really careful how he drives his car.
A
A
battery.
disconnected battery to engine ground. That's what caused it.
That's
And that causes,
Because whenever you go to start the car, it wasn't getting a good ground, and it would have to run down the frame, go into the axle, arc on the bearings, come back up the park brake cables to make it back to the engine.
wow.
Oh, yeah, I drove a car like that one.
Okay, but anyway, that's a true story. They bought the car back because the guy got sick of it, and it wound up at a school, you know, down in Jacksonville. I went to school down there for Mazda, and the instructor happened to notice that was loose. You know, that ground was loose, and he figured out by doing the math and driving the car and all that's what had been wrong with it the whole time.
makes very much sense.
Disconnected battery engine ground. We have actually seen, I've seen Mustangs like the one he's got that would have no starter operation at all. And you look at all of these wires look tight and all that kind of stuff. However, if I take my Tesla and I look at the ground and I turn it to start and I touch the tip of the Tesla to the engine block and it lights up, what do I know?
That's grounded out.
Do the engine blocks get power? It shouldn't.
Actually, it's supposed to get power, but where's that power supposed to go?
The starter.
Starter.
Yeah.
Through the ground. The starter is actually grounded to the engine block. Power goes into the starter, it's looking for ground. The only
So the
place you can get
starter
ground through your
is-
Tesla. So what do you have? You
So sorry.
basically got an engine round that's loose. And it wasn't loose, but we found this one here. It looked tight, it felt tight, it looked clean, but when you screwed it out, they'd used some kind of an anodized bolt that didn't connect good and it had paint on the block.
Oh my gosh.
So we took all that stuff off. Well, what's so funny was, you got that right, they'll do it.
I got good at that when I was little.
Well, what we got here is, so this right here, heavy EGR fluid out can be a problem. You're gonna feel a hot intake manifold. If your intake manifold's blistering hot and it's idling rough and it's got low vacuum, you're thinking EGR, you know? If you pull a vacuum line, it may not. If the EGR valve's trapped, got something trapped under it, it's gonna stretch timing chain can cause it. This is the least likely cause. This one right here, a loose harmonic balancer and a sheared crankshaft keyway. If you hadn't tightened that balancer up enough where it's pinching that gear against that crankshaft boss, and the crankshaft gear has got to be depended on to carry that load, where all that pressure is going to be on that keyway. They're going to shear the keyway. If it shears the keyway, the crankshaft gets ahead of the camshaft. You wind up with late valve timing. I've seen that before. Really throw you for a loop. If somebody puts that balancer back on, they didn't actually have a way to tighten it all the way up. They did it in the backyard, and they just tightened it up with a ratchet, and they figured that ought to be tight enough, because, oh, that feels tight. You know, but if it's not all the way up where it's got to be pinching that gear. I'll tell you something else. On vehicles with timing belts, if you got an Escort or something, like I've seen Ford Escorts do this, and you got this little setup right here on those, on a lot of the Escorts, you just pull the, spin the, you remember you didn't have to use a puller to get the balancer off an Escort, did you? Just pull it off your fingers. Somebody don't tighten that one up good. That balancer is doing this on that keyway. And it gets to where it wallows it out, and it can actually screw up the crankshaft. And so what happens is, after it's done this a few times, next thing you know, you're driving it, you got low power, because this has moved and it's changed the timing, because it's changed your relationship with the camshaft and this reluctor here for the sensor, and then it goes back the other way and it's normal. And then it moves again and it's low. You know, I've seen those. So I pull that out and you look and it's just wallowing around on there. You know?
Now,
because they didn't tighten the bolt.
waller it out, right?
Yeah.
Can you buy one that's a little bit bigger? Like if it was wallered out just a little bit, could you buy one a little bit bigger?
No, they don't have one of those. What you got to do there, if it screws the crankshaft up where the keyway has got that wallered out, you basically got to cram it back on there as good as you can and tighten it up as good as you can, or put a crankshaft in it. You know, it's kind of a mess. Got to replace the balancer. You need to put a keyway in there. You know, if you can't get the crankshaft straightened out, you got the 96 Ford Windstar comes into your shop with a Field 304 diagnostic trouble code and a misfire that only occurs when the engine's off idle.
You mean like when it's driving?
When you're off idle means you just crack the throttle a little bit, even sitting in a service bay.
Okay.
If you hold the throttle and keep the misfire steady while checking with your stethoscope, you find the number 4 injector stops clicking. Okay? Switching the vehicle off and restarting it, you find the injector starts working again. The injector feed and signal wires checked out fine all the way back to the PCM. What's the most likely cause? What about a bad injector that drops out when it reaches a certain temperature?
Yeah.
Trash in the fuel rail that moves away from the injector when the engine dies. Clogged EGR ports except the one feed number 4. What was that?
Number 4?
Wasn't I talking about that earlier? Clogged EGR ports except the one feed number 4. How would you determine that was a problem? I'm going to crack the throttle, and while it's skipping, I'm going to unplug the EGR valve, and if it smooths out, I know I found my problem. I got to pull the intake, got to get those little ports, and we'll see they're all clogged. I'm going to break that stuff out of them, blow it out good. Now see, it's got little EGR passages flowing down each side, coming out a little jet sort of a thing, about a 6mm hole. And if all of them plugged up but one, that's what you got to do. This is not a bad PCM driver. Why does the injector stop clicking? It knows there's a misfire on that cylinder. It doesn't want to damage the catalyst. Whenever misfire becomes consistent enough and it does enough counts, the engine controller shuts that injector down. So you can get led astray if you don't understand strategy. You see the way the thing works. If the injector is not clicking whenever it's been running and skipping a little while, you need to determine the factor of why it's really skipping. Number 9, a 1996 Mazda 6 286, kind of like that one out there, except it's got to be 6 in it. Comes in on the hook from a used car lot, spins like it's got no compression. Technician A says the timing belt's probably at fault. Technician B says the IEC may have stuck and caused the cylinders to wash down.
Check
gasoline. What would you do first? If I can fix it out there on the lot in just a very few minutes, that's what I'm going to do. I don't want to have to push that darn thing into the shop.
B.
I do B.
B.
Shot of engine oil, bring your compression up if it starts in. Is it going to hurt anything to put a shot of engine oil there? Heck no. Now, I will tell you this though. You gotta check and see if it's got spark, obviously, but, you know, cause let me ask you this, what if the coils have died, or if there's something that's keeps the coils from firing, but it's still squirting gasoline in there? That's gonna wash it down. Have you ever seen one that's been sitting up a long time, like an old pickup truck or something with a V8 in it, and you're spinning it over, and it's going rah, 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 rah. Even if you put a good strong battery in it, rah, 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 it's not, why is it not spinning?
That's what my dad's Dodge did.
Yeah, now why is that?
Uh,
High tension piston rings, all the oil's gone off the cylinder walls, and it's just really having to scratch dry.
It's
So
fighting
you
its way
squirt a
out.
bunch of automatic transmission fluid, top it off so you don't mess up an oxygen sensor with silicone. Squirt it down in there, get that thing spinning quick, and you're probably going to start up.
That's what automatic
My
transmission
papa
fluid?
used to,
Yeah, I use top F for that.
my papa used to say you had to do that or you break the rings and when it's setting up.
That's right. I mean, and the rust and all doesn't help either if it's got rust in the cylinders. But you're right. He was on the target.
But you told me to do that with the little battery thing though.
Pardon me?
When I was talking to you about that Monte Carlo the other day, about my brother's Monte Carlo, you told me.
Has it been setting up a long time?
Yeah.
You didn't tell me that. I mean, as far as, I didn't know it had been sitting up a long time. I just thought it was turning slow, you know, but all that. Now you know something you need to do. If it's been sitting up a long time, you gotta do that. 94 Olds Cutlass with a 3100 engine has no injector pulse.
3100?
3.1.
Uh,
The scan tool indicates the PCM receiving an RPM signal.
So that means
That's
it's
your first bit of
correct,
data.
sensor's working.
Technician A says, following a no start pinpoint test, finds a good signal from the crank sensor and condemns the ignition module. Technician B says the problem is probably not the ignition module.
Well, that's nice.
Neither.
Negative Nancy.
Huh?
Neither.
Negative Nancy.
Well, you're basically getting an RPM signal.
So you know the crank sensor's good.
You know the crank sensor is good. You check the crank sensor, you know the crank sensor is good and all that. I'm going to see if there's power going to the daggum injectors.
yeah.
Because I went up front one day and me and Sean went up there because one of them wouldn't start. It was a girl up there that had an old car similar to this. I checked the pink wire with a black stripe, you know, going to the injectors, or maybe it's just a pink wire. I don't know. Pink and black and pink are hot wires on GM. They had no power going to the injectors, and I went over here and there was a ignition switch was not powering up the relay that was going to drive the injector or something. Basically, I jumped some power in there, boom, she fired up, she drove home. I told her she needed to get it worked on though. But anyway, that is completes the.
What was that answer? B?
Yeah.
Okay.
What do you think? Technician B is right about that.
B.
Yeah. Hey, well, you don't condemn the ignition module, you know what I mean, until you're absolutely sure the ignition module is what it is. If you got a good signal going to it. Besides that, the ignition module, you got to look at how it's wired up. Is the ignition module going to make it fire the injector? You know, crank sensor uses for that.